All right, from the Student Fairfax City, we are very grateful that Steven Halpern accepted our invitation. Steven, welcome to my humble podcast, my friend.
Delighted to be here. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much. Steven, let's go back to the beginning of your life. Were you born like in a musical family? How old were you when you perhaps began taking, I don't know, guitar lesson, piano lesson? Your parents say, don't waste much to be, get an instrument or start to reading books
Right.
on music.
Very quickly, I was born actually in New York City. Fairly soon after that, the family moved out of one of the boroughs, one of the areas around New York City, which is called Flushing, New York.
Yeah.
And one of my earliest memories was in an apartment building that we lived in, where I would crawl down the hallway because one of the neighbors had music playing on their stereo. It was mono at that point, and my family never played any music. But even as a 1.5 year old, I'm crawling down and sitting in front of his door because there was already an attraction, a magnetic attraction for me with music. We moved to Long Island. I started getting into music through the school music system. They offered some equipment and instruments for band, and I chose trumpet because it looked easy. It was lighter than playing a trombone or a baritone. Didn't have as many keys as a clarinet or a saxophone, and only girls were playing flute back then. I knew I didn't want to play violin, but that's how I started. And I started taking classical trumpet lessons. Got very bored very quickly playing Little Black Dots written by dead white people, composers from Europe, and got turned on to improvisation. And that was when I really started getting involved in music, learning all the rules of chords and scales and which notes go with which chords. And at a certain point, things started flowing. I didn't know that I was a composer back then. I was just a good improvising trumpet player. After a couple years, my trumpet teacher said, if you really want to know music, you have to play a chord instrument, either piano or guitar. We didn't have a piano at home. We had no instruments, but then my mother started taking folk guitar lessons, and when she would finish, I would grab her guitar, go up to my room in the second floor, and practice for hours. And that's on a little nylon folk guitar, and that's how I first started learning about chords, and then very quickly graduated to electric guitar, and would practice for hours. The easiest comparison is that when you play trumpet, your lips get tired after a half hour or an hour. Guitar, I could play quietly with the amp off for hours. So that was my two-pronged career through high school. Played in bands. I led my own jazz band on trumpet, and played in an R&B band as lead guitarist. And at that point, it was all things like R&B, like Motown, Sam and Dave, Otis Redding, and then when rock started coming in, I was early on into that, and then the combination became jazz rock fusion, and I understood that concept, and I got very good with that and started a couple bands. And in my second year at the University of Buffalo, met a couple other musicians and started a jazz rock fusion band with horns, trumpet, give me a chance to play trumpet instead of just guitar, and with a trombone and saxophone player. Our inspiration with groups like Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which were all jazz musicians. We did some of their material. We started writing our own, and that was not a way to make a living, but it was great artistic inspiration. We got very good. We were invited to sign a contract, and we thought we were going to have a career as a jazz rock band like Chicago and Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Got ripped off in New York, and that was going to be the end of my music career, I thought, because that was one big jazz. make a long story short, I started playing mostly on trumpet because I could carry that around with me, and sitting in with bands, and became a well-known jazz trumpet player, not only in Buffalo, but also when I came out to California. But it was when I came out to California that the other part of my life, which was also and always about spiritual development, spiritual searching and learning about meditation, and from my teachers in Buffalo, who are poets and musicians, learning about the ancient tradition where musicians or artists or sculptors, writers and poets would tune in to their muse for inspiration. And that was a concept that at first I said, well, that's good for those guys. They lived in ancient Greece, several thousand years ago. But what if I could tune into that? So I started praying and in my meditation saying, I want to connect with my own muse. And for a number of years, nothing really spectacular happened. But now, when I got to California, I experienced a deep meditation in a sacred redwood forest and suddenly began hearing music in my head that I had never heard before. As a jazz musician, we are trained to do what's called needle drop tests. Within the first couple notes, you need to identify which musician, which album, and which part of his career. And that was part of the ego and the intellectual study, because you needed to learn the history of the field. But my history was also ethnomusicology. In fact, I was set up and designed a graduate program in cross-cultural forms and expressions of healing music, most of which, and this is what I'm now coming back to talk more about, was trance-related, like African music, which is 90% trance-related, a lot of Indian music. The instruments themselves have a tone that shifts the mind into the deep alpha state. And I wanted to know more about that, to experience more of that, and was going to study that. But on my way to going into grad school, I wound up in California for 2 weeks and had an experience where in this sacred redwood forest, I started hearing music, and this is basically the first big chapter in my memoir. Within an hour or two after that meditation, I was mistaken for a person who was applying for a job at a human potential weekend workshop and growth center, like Esalen, very internationally famous Esalen Institute. And I was invited to meet the staff. I went to the building I thought was their building. No one was there, but there was a piano. So I walk into the room, sit down at the piano, and go into trance, go into an altered state, a non-drug related, purely inspirational state where I was hearing music and then playing the music, but I wasn't aware of what I was playing. About 10 minutes later, somebody coughed, and I looked around, and suddenly the staff, there's 10 people in the room, and they say, who is this guy? How did he get here? Who invited him here? And how'd you learn to play like that? And I said, play like what? Because I hadn't heard, because I'm in an out-of-body state, the music that I was playing. So it was just flowing through, and that became the template and the basic operations where my deepest recordings come when I get myself out of the way. And that was, Claudia, indeed what my jazz teachers taught us, that you learn all the rules, you practice so that you can play all the runs, but then you let spirit take over. And spirit coming through, you tap into a higher level of energy, of consciousness. And my first way of getting there was through jazz improvisation. Some very heavy and fast, intense rhythms. But then this new music had no rhythm at all, basically. No melody. It was very different. And the first people that heard it said, I feel so relaxed. How'd you learn to play like that? And at first, I didn't know what they were talking about, but one of the first scientists who heard that said we could see that people are relaxing and going into meditation, but if your music really is something unusual, doing something different than regular music, certainly different than classical music, which was not designed for meditation in general, but even different than Debussy or Ravel, the Impressionists, who were some of my ideological patron saints, because they were at least trying to break free of the structure of Western classical music, which, by the way, is some of the only music in the world that is left brain analytical and not right brain, more holistic and more meditative in terms of tone and not being as rigid in general. So I am now presented with an opportunity. He says, what you need to do is you need to prove and do scientific research that your music produces different brain waves, different effects on the body, because people are saying, I've never felt so relaxed before. And that's all well and good. That's called subjective response. Scientists said, you need to get objective data. And I said, I'm a musician. What does that mean? You need to conduct brainwave biofeedback research. And I said, great. I'm not a scientist. I don't know how to do that. I don't have access to, biofeedback equipment. And this scientist, Dr. Stanley Krippner, said, there's a new program, a new graduate program, that we would love to have somebody do that. He's the director, and he said, if you apply to our new program, I will make sure that you get in, because we want somebody to do innovative, groundbreaking research on music and consciousness. And that became my focus. And at first I was kicking and screaming, I'm a musician, don't talk to me about research and statistics. So I hired, and I don't know how to do that. So he said, but we have a team, you could hire them. So I hired them, and they did the work. And as we're running through 100 subjects over a couple of weekends, the results were astounding. And we could see in the biofeedback results that my music was blowing classical music out of the most relaxing classical music by Liszt. As a solo pianist, my solo piano recordings blew it out of the water. The difference night and day. And they said, you need to tell the world about this. You need to share this music with the world, because there's nothing like it. This is 1973. I had the experience where I started hearing the music in 1969, almost on this date, at the end of 1969. But there was no music program, there was no music genre called meditation music. There certainly wasn't a field called New Age music. And when you go to the music stores to buy records, they'd say, where's the beat? Where's the melody? Where are the words? We don't know where to put this, so thank you very much. Come back, when you have something else. So I dealt with that for a while and would make individual recordings for people. But it wasn't until 1975 that conferences on New Age consciousness and meditation started happening publicly. And since I was interested in all that, and spirituality, etc., I would go to the conferences, and I'd bring my electric piano and became one of the presenters. And that really put me on the stage and put me out in the world, where then other conferences would hire me, and I would then go to the various stores, and which were typically metaphysical bookstores, and they would say the same thing. We're a bookstore. We don't sell music. And I said, well, this is my first album, and I look at it now, and I understand why they were confused, because it doesn't say anything about music, but this was the words I heard in my head to describe a new way to listen, not to listen to melody and harmony, but to focus on the inner expression, to experience how you feel, and the aspect of that that's become clear in the last 10 years or so, going back to the initial research in 1973, is that when you listen to most music, and I'll give you an example, if I sing a recognizable pattern of notes, notice what you could feel. And everybody who's listening, you don't even have to close your eyes for this, but notice what you hear in your head, notice what you feel in your chest, become aware of your breathing. And I will sing do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. And if I don't finish, most people hear that last note of the octave, do, in their head. They could feel that they're holding their breath because they expect what's going to happen next. And what my music does is it breaks those expectations. Well, guess what? That pissed off classical, critics. It pissed off the whole classical or music genre. It didn't relate to rock music because there weren't words, although the new age of when rock and roll became rock music, there were some extended versions that got pretty trippy, but it was always based on rhythm. Very rarely was this just an ambient soundscape. But that's what I was hearing before Eno and before other people were doing things like that. This is what I was doing privately. And when I started sharing this with stores, they said, as I said, we don't sell music. The very first store I went to, as I'm holding, in fact, this was the album I was holding up, a little old lady comes over, and this was a name I heard in my head. It's a christening for listening. The research came from the biofeedback research we did with plants and the electromagnetic energy field, the aura, Kirlian photography. She said, "Oh, I'm looking for music for meditation. Can I buy that album?" At which point the manager of the bookstore said, "Well, I guess I better take 12 of your albums and see if anybody else wants to buy them." They sold out in a week, and I took that information to every other store I'd go to and said, "Your competitor just bought 12 of these," and learned part one of how to be marketing music as an independent musician. 1975 was when I first got in a studio, and I experienced love at first sound. I understood and I loved the way that I could control with the engineer the EQ and the tone of every instrument and every song that I was playing. And I knew I wanted to do more of this, but at that point there was no field, there was no way to sell the music, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to do another recording. This is now 1975. The anniversary is coming up on January 4th and January 5th, 1975. Anyway, enough people, when I connected with the first pressing plant that can make LPs in the San Francisco Bay Area that was not run by a major label, I was their first client. And I was the first client of the first independent recording studio that I met at a Christmas party, who invited me, to record at his new studio. And that is what got me on the road to recording. But guess what? When the first 1,000 LPs showed up at my house, in my little apartment, they sat there. And that was when I learned that being a musician and being a new age music, and part of what my job was not just to play the music, not just to hear the music, and not just to go into meditation on my own playing the music, but to share it with others. And that forced me to begin to learn about marketing and the world of business as an independent. I learned to do a lot of it. I never learned how to do bookkeeping. Was not good at that, so I always would hire people. That was a good and bad, as it turned out, because some of them took advantage of that. But that's how I started. And when I started going out there, I went to many cities around the United States. Enough other people started, picking up on that and doing music similar to or inspired by me. And then some of them were hearing their own music. And I took that and then became the first, created a new genre in the music stores, in the record stores. And things went on from there. A lot of fake meditation music came out. Even Chara, the bombshell South American personality and guitar player, When I went to see her in 1994 in San Francisco, she said, "My agent says this is my new age song." And I asked her, "What makes it new age?" "I have a synthesizer in the background." But she's playing the same beautiful flamenco. But I said,
Yeah.
that doesn't make it new age. Your music is not new age. The instrument does not. It's the consciousness. It's what you are playing. It's where you are in your state of being, in your consciousness, in your mind, in your body. And that was also when I learned if I was stressed when I was recording, which many, many people are, including classical great performers, when you're recording, you're under stress to not waste time, to not make mistakes. One of the beauties of being a composer and playing my own music is people wouldn't know if I made a mistake unless it was really obvious, in which case the engineer and I would just erase that and no one would ever hear that. So that's how I got involved in it, and over the years continued recording at least 1 or 2 albums a year, and the first stores would sell it, and then at these conferences people would find out about me, and I'd get invited to New York or Chicago or all over the United States, and then to Canada and to England. I was at the first International Mind, Body, Spirit Conference, and that put me on the international map. And people from Ghana, Nigeria, from Africa, as well as Germany and France, say, "We've heard about this." And then 1975, there's no internet. How did you guys hear about it? It's not even all around the United States, but people brought copies back from the United States with them to Germany
Right.
on cassette or an LP in all these other countries. And that really stimulated many other musicians to start doing their own work and created a genre that did not have a great name, so it was called New Age music because it was played at the New Age conferences and science and consciousness and spirituality conferences and the healing conferences when they needed somebody to talk about the interface of healing in music or meditation in music or stress reduction in music or holistic medicine and holistic health and stress management in music. I was the guy because I needed that help because I was pretty stressed out and didn't even know it. But when I got some medical tests, the first time I hadn't seen doctors in years, I said, if you don't learn how to manage your stress, a lot of my biological tests were off the scale. And the doctor comes back in the room and says, "How are you even walking around?" I said, "What do you mean?" Said, "Well, your stomach acid is off the scale. This thing is off the scale." And he says, if you don't learn how to manage your stress, you're going to have problems in 10 or 15 years. It's going to cost you a lot of money. So cost me a lot of money when I am living on starving artist wages. I realized from the research, my music was the #1 non-drug stress reducing thing that I could do for myself. And I shared that with other people and became the #1 person doing stress management music. And that became another main focus of what I would do over the years. Now, I'll say one other thing. About 8 months ago, a new name started being used and was put out by Apple Music, and it was called sound therapy music, which was, I go, wait a minute, I was calling my music sound therapy music in 1975, but the Music Therapy Association said, since I was not a certified music therapist, I couldn't even call my music sound therapy. And besides, people did not want to admit that they needed any kind of therapy. But suddenly, so I was doing sound healing and meditation music and what I called anti-frantic music. But in the last 9 months or so, there's a whole new genre. And Claudio, when I did a search, I was completely opposite. I was completely absent from that search engine site. So I've been rebranding my music, which people in the New Age know about for 45, 50 years, as sound therapy music. And I was talking about, even on my very first albums, of talking about ambient soundscapes. In fact, this concept of the world of soundscapes is, like landscapes. I didn't invent the word. Dr. R. Murray Schafer, who's a musical a scientist who would record nature and how nature is changing, and he was based in Canada. And I realized that my music, without melody and standard harmony and rhythm, are more like soundscapes, but they're even less musical than the impressionistic music of Debussy and Ravel and Satie. And I brought in the word soundscapes before Eno, before anyone else was calling my music soundscapes. And it's interesting that now very few people know that history. And in fact, there are conferences and books now that say Halpern shouldn't be allowed to call the music soundscapes. And I go, excuse me, I basically invented the term for America. Don't tell me what I can do, because you guys wouldn't be in business if it weren't for me 50 years ago.
Right.
So, there's some of my New York attitude comes in from that. And ambient, Sam says, ambient meaning there's no obvious melody or rhythm, but it's more of like Monet. It's more of a feeling. And then we describe the music being. It's not just about the notes, but it's the energy that comes through, and that is different than most jazz. There's a lot of great music out there, and there's a lot of crap, a lot of badly played instrumental, contemporary instrumental, or sound therapy, or new age music. So there's a whole lot else where we could talk about that, but it was my concept and my dharma and my calling, as I began to really understand it, to bring this music out in the world. And that's what I've been doing for the last 50 years as an independent, with one or two times where I licensed my music to another company, and then they wound up putting me into this close to bankruptcy, and then I had to start all over again. So
Wow.
that's part of how we got here today.
Yeah. Wow. A lot of questions to ask you. I need to unravel all the stuff and everything you have. By the way, do you know an institute like an hour from here where I live? I live in Northern Virginia, called the Monroe Institute.
Again?
The Monroe Institute,
Oh, sure.
with the Hemi Sync, and they do very
Yes.
interesting stuff, And
Well, I knew them, of course, from Journeys Out of the Body and Robert Monroe.
correct.
And the first time I went to Virginia, I went to see him. This was
Yeah.
1985 was the first time I was there. And we talked about combining my music with his frequencies.
Yeah, Hemi Sync, they call it. Yeah, Hemi.
Right.
Yeah.
But the concept was, that was his individual name for it. But what they were using was just synthesizer waveforms, like a fake ocean, or some of the other companies that were happening at that time would actually just have one of the people there go with their voice, like a fake ocean. It's like wind.
Fake office, yeah.
And I took the first weekend. All I got was dizzy, so I didn't, get officially out of the body. I go out of the body, during dreams, like everybody, in meditation. But I didn't with that. And the equipment that he had was just for cassettes, and there were no engineers making sure the equipment was not having wow and flutter. And I remember saying, Bob, I'd love to do joint ventures with you, but your, used equipment is not up to spec. It's making my music go slow and fast, which doesn't matter if you're listening to a fake ocean. But it really matters if it destroys the music. So we didn't do anything at that point. 15 years later, I licensed a couple albums to them, but I know them, I respect their work, and a lot of the music that they have put out in the world, some is listenable, some gives me a headache or a stomach ache, and But he was definitely one of the pioneers. And then very clear to where he is, which would obviously be where you are now, was a man called Master Charles Cannon and the Synchronicity Organization. I met him in 1986 at a conference, 1986 and 87, and he said one of the stories I heard is he moved to that area, one, because that's where he was told to go in meditation, but also because Monroe was near there. And he said, when we started describing what he does, what I do, he says, I know what you do. I was listening to your Spectrum Suite and your cassettes in India at the ashram of Swami Muktananda. So he and I did some work together. We started doing some concerts where his people would do the aromas with the incense and the lighting with the blue and purple and the brainwave entrainment. So he was also an early brainwave entrainment pioneer, as was I. My music was out in the world. After Monroe, my music and Richard Sutphin and then Barry Konikoff were the first three companies to really put out music plus brainwave entrainment. Now, I could tell you that in 1980, a lot of people didn't know what brainwaves were, let alone what brainwave entrainment was. So it was a tough sell, and I would only put one or two songs on an album, and then I started doing entire albums that were focused on including brainwave entrainment on every track. And when my first album featuring brainwave entrainment, and was called Deep Alpha, that was the the New Age Grammy Award nominee in 2012. It should have won. It didn't, because there was some politicking and a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff that I can't talk about now. But that helped kick off the huge new interest, and many dozens and now hundreds of sites on YouTube and on the internet that include brainwave entrainment. And still I find people who don't know what a brainwave is, let alone when I did my first album with chakras, to balance and heal the chakras, which is what Christening for Listening became Spectrum Suite, and then became Chakra Suite, to balance the energies of the chakras for the spiritual benefit, for the holistic health benefit. I got tossed off of some radio interviews because people didn't know what a chakra was. I actually had one of the hosts say, are you mispronouncing chocolate? Do you mean chocolate? I said, what flavor? No. A chakra, 5,000 years the yogis know about these etheric energy centers. And part of my early teaching was to talk about that each of the 7 chakras have an associated frequency and an associated color. And this music would be a way for the body to naturally entrain and resonate and come into a higher level of coherence. Well, it turns out that people didn't know what the word coherence was. And now, 15 years or so after my first big contribution to the field, a lot more people are doing music with brainwave entrainment. A lot of the music now is even composed by AI. For me, it's unlistenable, but it's out there. And I still find people in workshops and on podcasts who say, what is a brainwave? What is a chakra? So I get a chance to do some spiritual teaching. And then I realize, where in our educational system do we get taught about our brain? We get taught about certain things, our heartbeat, but we don't get taught about how the brain and the heart are connected, and how when you get into a deeply relaxed state, one of the scientists who was one of my major mentors, Itzhak Bentov, who wrote the book Stalking the Wild Pendulum, identified how when you get into a deeply relaxed state, whether you get there by doing yoga or meditation or looking at the ocean or sitting at the edge of a lake, your body shifts into a frequency at which the energy and the blood going out of the heart into the brain becomes synchronized. Your brain waves shift into an 8 cycle per second deep alpha state naturally. And if you don't live near the ocean or a forest, I said, I don't live near the ocean or a forest. Near the ocean, but it's an hour away. I want to get there by sound, by music. I don't want to, and I want to be able to do it by myself. I don't want outside stimulation. Or plant medicine is great, and that becomes useful at other times, but I want to do it naturally, drug-free, and that's how I began to market. And that was, again, something I did for myself first. When I began, I was not really thinking about taking it out to the world. It was something that I did that was instant meditation. I come from New York, out near New York City. We don't want to wait. It was like, I want my relaxation and I want it now. I don't want to take, like the music therapist would say, listen to this album and after an hour, you'll be relaxed. And I look at them, and this is I said it to the president at the time of the Music Therapy Association, I'd be out of my mind in an hour. What do you got that'll get me there in a minute? And they said, it's impossible. There's no music that could do that. And I said, check this out. And I showed them my research. I showed them the science. And they said, whoa. And then they hired me to do some keynotes at their conferences. But, but the classical contingent were very upset with me because they thought I was dishonoring Mozart or Beethoven or the great masters. I was more attuned to Debussy and the Impressionists and Liszt and Chopin in the later years. And of course, I'll mention another name, Scriabin, who was doing compositions and symphonies with sound and light. Some of it is dissonant, but I always felt a connection with him and had some experiences psychically with his energy a couple times in my life that I talk about in my memoir that were just mind-blowing. As I've had, and we don't have time to go into all the ways that I was shown who was helping me, because early on, when I started playing where I didn't know where the music was coming from, all I knew was I was not sitting down at my desk with a pen and ink on a staff paper and writing down the notes. I was not at the piano or on my guitar composing. So where was the inspiration coming from? 1978, I'm working with Dr. Jean Houston, and she told the story of Mozart. And people say, Mozart, you're such a genius. How do you get all your ideas? How do you write your music? And he would say, well, sometimes I'm walking down the road, with trees, and maybe the sun is coming through near sunset at an angle. And suddenly, the lighting and everything, I start hearing music in my head. And I thank God that it sounds Mozartian, and all I do is write it down. And I said, whoa, that's kind of what I do, except I don't have to write it down. I can record it right onto a tape machine. And that was the basis. When I did privately and then would go in the studio, I was able to go into an altered state virtually instantaneously. And sometimes it happened before I even knew it was happening. And because I had a chance to work with the same engineer for 10 years in the early days, when he saw that happening, or sometimes as I felt the shift happening inside me, I'd say, Roger, put on a fresh reel of tape. I'll see you in a half hour, because that's how long a reel of 2-track analog tape would last at 15 IPS, because we had low budget, and so we didn't have the highest fidelity. But then Dolby SR came out, so we could record at slower rates. And that's how I was recording. And people say, we don't understand it. He comes in, he doesn't rehearse, he does one take, and it's done. That was a solo track, so I became a bit of a celebrity in the music studio, And then, of course, we get into overdubs, and then started getting into more sophisticated and multi-dimensional and multi-level recordings. Would bring in other musicians, and they would sometimes pick up on the energy and do some of the best music of their life on my project. So, as a producer, I let's see. I guess that's something coming in from your end. So that was part of my gift, and I've always acknowledged that I've had unseen helpers. And if people read some of my, can you hear that in the background? There's some other voices.
No, I don't. I think
Wow.
somebody up there is channeling.
Okay. Well, there's nobody in this building, but I'll just
Yeah.
try to ignore that for a while. It
Sure.
was on some of my albums. I mean, a lot of this would happen on my own at home, but then it happened in the studio, and it happened where it was witnessed by the engineer. And then in 1978, I was speaking at New York City, and one of the other presenters said, "You'd like to meet my sister?" And I said, "Well, I have a girlfriend." He said, No. She's, 30 years older than us, but it's my older sister, but she works with Uri Geller and Dr. Andrea Puharich, and they work with ETs." And I said, "Sure." And they said, and then when we got out to their house, the beings channeled through her, and they said, "Would you like a lesson at the little piano?" And I actually had an intergalactic psychic music lesson from this being that also was able to control the piano. And not only could he assist me and make the piano play smoothly, it was a little old, out of tune spinet, suddenly sounds like a grand piano. And the four of us in the room heard it. We were recording this on a little tape recorder, and then we're told, when the private lesson is going on, do not record this part, turn off the tape recorder. And you hear me say, "Nobody move." How will they know? They're not physically in the room. And when we got to the end and the session is over, we play the tape back, and right after you hear the voice saying, "Turn the tape recorder off," you hear me say, "Don't turn it off," the tape goes blank for 10 minutes. Now, physically, as a recording engineer, there is no way for that to happen, because on a cassette, reel to reel, it's analog. You could see the little wheel still spinning around, son.
That's right.
And you
Yeah.
can see the record tab is still on. So I've shown this to engineers. They said, there's no way that happened. And yet it happened. So that was part of the mind-blowing aspect that got me fully invested in continuing this path. So that's a lot of how. So Monroe, yes, so he was ahead of the game and ahead of it. But there's so many other aspects to using brainwave entrainment. And what I've also done a lot is to use that as an extra dimension for meditation and for subliminal affirmations. So we get the individual, we get the listener into the most receptive brainwave state, which when I use either a deep alpha or some deep theta states, they hear the subliminal messages even if they don't hear the words. And when I am recording, Claudio, I go into deeper states. And indeed, when I first recorded deep alpha and deep theta, those were the first days that I listened to headphones while I was recording. So I was definitely in those states, and the music just flowed. I didn't have to think about anything. When I sit down at the keyboard, I don't know what I'm going to play. So that was part of what Keith Jarrett would do in his concerts, and we wait for inspiration. Inspiration came, and that's been the working model of my recordings over the years.
Gotcha. Wow. Yeah. Wow. A lot of questions that I have. Are there, when recording, any specific sort of angelic being that you work with, or specific entities
Could you
that you
speak a little
hold?
louder, please?
Okay, so in general, when in a studio, when recording, are there specific angelic beings that you work with, or specific entities that you call upon, or
Well,
they
interesting.
just show up?
I I do I call upon my guides and
Yeah,
higher dimensional beings.
yeah.
And when I asked about that, what I was told is we don't want you to get hung up on the name. And I've heard this from because it's not just one. I've had other people say, "Well, you first channeled in the redwood forest from the Pleiadians." And there were some others. I know I channeled from the Ogata group because they told me, and that was one with Puharich and the others. But other ones, I was told, we don't even want you sharing those names back through most of my career because people will get hung up on that, and we want the music to speak for itself. But over the years, I've had a number of different psychics and spiritual teachers who have seen and know that it's not just one, but at various times, different higher dimensional beings. And I have been able to feel presences and identify some, but again, not by name. And, it's like some of my friends say, well, I'm channeling from this being. I was okay with not having an answer for that and just say, judge it by the results. And that's how I've been. And I'll share some of that in my memoir also, because those stories have been in the line notes. If you read the liner notes of my Eastern Peace album, I talk about working with the channel that worked through Puharich and Uri Geller. If you listen to Ancient Echoes, the opening chant, working with Georgia Kelly in 1978, in the early days, we did some beautiful harp and piano and harp and flute. At the end, as I'm saying goodnight, and when we finished the session, a chant starts coming out of my mouth. A chant with the vowels, A-E-I-O-U. And no one was more shocked than me because I'm not known as a vocalist. And it was like, where is this coming from? And I look at them, we just turned off all the equipment. I said, we're not done. Let's turn all the equipment back on. And that became the title track of Ancient Echoes. So I don't know where that came from, but I don't usually see visions when I'm recording. I saw visions of white-robed priests out by the pyramid and sacred temples. And a couple of years, actually it was about 8 years later, I had somebody from the Rosicrucian Society come up to me at one of my concerts and said, who gave you permission to use one of our sacred chants? And I said, what do you mean? Well, the chant on Ancient Echoes, no one is allowed to use that unless we give them permission. And you're not, a fifth degree student. You have, so how did that happen? And I said, well, I'm in the studio, and it just came through me. In which case, they said, well, in that case, you're an honorary, Rosicrucian. Would you like to be the keynote speaker and perform at our national conference this year? So, I've had situations like that happen where there was third-party confirmation that I didn't know about beforehand, but yet the people who were in that tradition recognize it, and it's probably true. I mean, there are some. I've had deeper meditations and lighter meditations, and some that would just seem to be, at a certain point, I learned to be able to do this in the conscious mind. So not everything I do, like in concert, if there's somebody coughing, that breaks the spell. So I'm not in a deep meditative state, but because I've played enough, the energies are in my fingers, and I know enough of the structures that I could perform without being in a deep state. But in the studio, I am so often guided, and I listen to music I record in the studio, in meditation when I get home, and as I fall asleep, and then I hear things in dreams, and I get suggestions. Sometimes I'll wake up and write down a little note, or I'll sing something into a little handheld tape recorder, and the next time I get in the studio, I'm able to recreate that. I have a photographic memory for most every track on every album that I've recorded on multi-track, 16 and then 32 track reel to reels, and now on computer, going back 50 years, so I could pull something that I could build upon. If I'm hearing, as I'm shown now, I could take a phrase from an album I did in 1978 that was part of a 5-minute song, and I could take that track and expand that and have a new 5-minute song that the only thing I brought in was the state of consciousness and this 20-second theme. And that has allowed me to have so much more inspiration without having to do a whole bunch of new things. There are things that I didn't even realize were in the middle of some tracks when I recorded it, but when I go back and listen now, it's like they glow, or I am directed to say, this is the beginning of a new song. And that's what I've used on some of the new albums like Psychedelic Therapy, music for microdosing, and of course the album called Sound Healing. I know we can't play music for people right here, but on my website, people can hear, and they can listen to this and track down samples on Spotify or Amazon. But a lot of those places you only get 30-second samples, but on Spotify and Pandora, you could hear a lot of my music. Or Amazon.com, you could hear a lot of the music. You could buy a lot of the music. You could buy the CDs. There's still a lot of people that love CDs, a lot of people that don't have CD players. A lot of people I find don't even know what a CD is anymore. But you could stream the music, and my job is to make it available to as many people as possible.
Sure.
Because one of the very first things I was told in 1969, the first psychic who heard me playing live on their little upright piano, right when I came out of the forest, the redwood forest, was, your job, you need to take this music. People all over the world are going to be meditating to your music. It's going to be a healing for people all over the world. And I'm going, excuse me, I don't even own a keyboard. There's streaming music. The internet hadn't been invented yet. How are people all over the world going to hear this music? So that didn't make any sense to me at that point in time. But when the internet, and then of course CDs started traveling and cassettes started traveling, and then when the internet really kicked in, I'm starting to get, emails from people from Africa, from China, from Japan, where I did a tour in 1993, and from other places. I go, wow, how did that psychic know that in 1969 before I had done any recording? And that was the part that was so much confirmation for me that on some level, this was my destiny. This was my calling. This is why I incarnated, to help manifest and bring this music out into the world, and to build upon the training that I received at the University of Buffalo, learning about the ancient poets and musicians who would tune into their muse. Now we talk about channeling. When people talked about being inspired by their muse, I never heard anyone talk about channeling. So when I first was interviewed, I would talk about channeling the music, and I got kicked off of some of the radio shows and kicked off of some of the TV shows. It's like, that's a little too far off for us, son. Next, and they cut to commercial, and I was out of there. So I learned not to admit to channeling in public. And it's just like, I get inspired, or I go into state, I get into the flow state, I get into the deep theta state, now that we can talk about brainwaves, and that's where I tap into a level of creativity that's much more than just my intellect. I know we're running short on time, but I wanted to get that in.
No, we're good. It seems to me that you have had a lot of synchronicities in your life. I mean, you were, perhaps like you said before, you were born to do this job, your life. So
Absolutely.
isn't that you chose music? Maybe music found you, right?
Well, I chose it, and music did find me, but it found me because I chose it. I chose the
Yeah.
parents, I did, I believe, who were non musicians, because if I came up in a musical family, they would have made me listen to classical music all the time. And I would
Yeah.
have been, brainwashed that classical music is the best music in the world ever.
Hmm.
And this allowed me to find my own way. But I've had a number of other psychic readings, and uh, one of the readings who taps into Edgar Casey said that you were with some of the priests, and you were a priest in ancient Egypt working in the Temple of Healing, and you were a musician priest. So I have had, through my incarnations, that through line where that has been something. Also, I've told I've had lifetimes in Israel in the court of King Solomon. Now, I don't have a specific memory of that, but early in my life, this life, the first time I ever heard men chanting a tonic and a fifth, low drones, oh, that is the fundamental harmonic in music, the tonic and the fifth, do, re, mi, fa, so. I went into the zone. I went out of my body. And I didn't care what the words were. I didn't care what the teachings were. I would go just to hear these two men when they would sometimes chant together. And over the years, that was part of my attraction to a lot of deep chanting and, of course, yoga chanting. And one of the reasons I recorded my album Om Zone now and then recorded as Om Zone 432 hertz was because that was the background that I was hearing. And it's always more fun to sing with some others and to chant when you have a harmonic foundation rather than just to chant by oneself. I got bored. So in a yoga class, we have other people to sing. Some of them sing out of tune, which was also difficult for me with near perfect pitch. So I got myself and some other great vocalists to record the tonic and the fifth. And that's what you'll hear on my Om Zone albums. And again, I didn't realize when I first heard the cantor and the rabbi chanting that I was having a past life experience. But that tone, because Western music, very rarely do you hear just the tonic and the fifth, just the sustained drone tones. When synthesizers, the only instrument that could do sustained tones was a great pipe organ. And what I would do, because I didn't own a keyboard at that time, I would sneak into churches when they weren't having services, and sometimes ask permission, sometimes not. I'd sneak up to the organ and just play like a C note and a G note, and just hold that and hear music in my head, and then do little vocal improvisations like Indian music chanting. And then I found it was usually better to get permission. So I played the big organ at the Church of St. John the Divine in New York, Westminster Church in England. And as soon as I get into playing, I'm out of my body. I'm just not aware of what I'm playing, but I'm playing modes, typically in C or D minor, which are simple for an easy finger placement. But the sound is what would really be magical. And when I would do the organ sound in my concerts, at the end of a piece, and this happened several times, you could hear a pin drop, at which point I realized it's not just me who's out of my body, the entire audience is out of their body, because they're not listening to fast do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. They're just listening to the sustained ambient soundscapes. In other words, we shut down the analytical mind. We let the brain get balanced, and instead of just the left hemisphere, we have the left and right hemisphere balanced in a high coherence state. And that's the ultimate for healing, the ultimate for meditation. And that's now what I am really sharing with people. And most music does not do that because it's left brain dominant. And most musicians are trained to be left brain dominant. And most listeners, if you're listening with familiarity, or you know where the scale is going, you know the next notes, you know where the melody is going, PDQ Bach, when you play certain chords, you know what's going to follow. I was able to destroy that directionality, and in the process piss off a lot of people, but also really contribute to a lot of people's spiritual growth, because I said, I've been looking for this music like this for years, and now I found it. And that's, and, you know, that was when people would send emails and return postcards to me. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily, you know, they'll like me on Facebook or something, but we know that when people are listening, they are having an experience. And that's more than any awards that, and even if they don't realize that their brains are going to a higher level of coherence and balance and synchronization, we know from testing so many different people that this is happening. And because that's happening, I continue to make new albums and to work with, because for me, working on a new album is a great high for myself. Because in order to do this music, I have to be in the state. So it forces me, as an ADHD adult, an adult ADHD, you know, in the last number of years, to get quiet, to focus, and because without that, I could play the notes, but they don't feel right. And that was one of the big things I also learned from Dr. John Diamond with muscle testing. You can play the right notes, and this is true of many classical pianists and composers. You can play the right notes, but if you're coming from ego, and we want the audience to be impressed with our virtuosity, that blocks the healing energy. So I, in concerts, I don't get hung up on playing the most fancy music, but I will usually, at least once in a concert, do something fancy, and I could hear people going, I didn't know he could play that fast, or I didn't know he could do that. And then sometimes I could, you know, see some people who were brought by their girlfriend or something sitting in the front row who were not enthusiastic, and I'm able to even sometimes feel who those people are. And I remember one time in Tucson in 1980, the first time that was so clear, I said, you, sir, did the person next to you, your girlfriend, make you come here tonight? He said, yes. How did you know? I felt the dissonance coming from you. So I reached in my pocket, pulled out a $20 bill. Take this $20 bill. This is your refund for your ticket. Please leave. Because your energy is blocking my energy on stage, and I can't hear the music inside. And he got up, he was very embarrassed, he turned bright red, but he got up and left, and I got a standing ovation from the audience. These people are here, sir, to hear me. They're not here to to hear you blocking me. So that was when, that was in Moscow, because I saw Uri Geller do that, and I thought he was faking it. Until that happened to me. And I've done that over the years. And if I don't know exactly who it is, I just put it out there. If anyone is not liking this, and someone else dragged you here, we'll offer a refund. But we want to have a coherent, unified consciousness. And my concerts were group healing events, not necessarily just performances. And that was where I began and was studying back in Buffalo and learning about the rights of Eleusis. And my first jobs and gigs as a musician were as a spiritual focus at musical events, even before I played this new music. But that was what some of my teachers were doing, and anchoring that energy and setting up a context in which people could have their own meditative spiritual experience.
Yeah, wow, what a story. Thank you very much, Steven. We've been talking for like an hour or something, and I'm
Yes.
quite sure we can talk a lot more. So why don't we do do a part two and a part three, because it's a lot of questions I would like to argue when we can go deeper into some aspect that. But that was a very good introduction. Thank you for your honesty, for opening up, and you have done very well in your life, and I'm happy that we met. And you have done close to 100 albums, so and played everywhere, and people know you. So it was very nice talking to you. We'll send you a direct link, and then we'll arrange it to do a part two and a part three, because
Right,
you
probably
have a
in the
lot
new
to say,
year,
man.
and probably what we could do also, for homework, I would just recommend, today we talked about sound healing and chakra
Yeah,
suite and some of the albums, but on my homepage
yeah,
is where some of the bestsellers are and some of the most important albums are.
sure.
And I now have an article talking about brainwave entrainment, brainwave synchronization,
Yeah,
and starting to really speak more openly. And no sooner did I put that on my website is I saw 3 other articles on the internet copying me. So not only did they copy the music, but they copied the ideas.
yeah,
But
terrible. Yeah,
that's the world now.
yeah, absolutely. It was very nice talking to you, Steven, and have a good afternoon. Thanks again, man, my friend.
Thank you.
Sure, no
Blessings.
problem.
Bye-bye, everybody.